They called me cruel. They called me ungrateful. But when the man my mother married put his hands on me and declared I had no rights in my own lake house, something inside me hardened for good. They saw me as weak, a daughter they could manipulate. What they didn't see were the property deeds locked in my safe. Each page a testament to my name and my name alone. They thought family ties would be enough to steal my dream. My name is Emily Carson. I'm 34 years old, and for the last decade, my life has been a carefully curated collection of blueprints, fabric swatches, and color palettes. As a freelance interior architect, I don't just design spaces. I build sanctuaries. I orchestrate the flow of light through a room, the feel of a wooden floor under bare feet, the exact shade of gray that brings calm to a chaotic mind. I've poured my soul, my savings, and countless sleepless nights into creating havens for other people. This year, I finally built one for myself. It's a lake house tucked away in a quiet corner of suburban Michigan, shielded by a thick stand of white pines. It's not grand or ostentatious. It's a modest A-frame structure, with a cedar plank exterior that has weathered to a soft silver. The real magic is inside and out back. A wall of floor-to-ceiling windows frames a perfect, uninterrupted view of Lake Huron. Its moods shifting from glassy calm in the morning to a choppy, white-capped canvas in the afternoon winds. I spent years saving for this place, taking on extra projects, driving a 10-year-old car, and living in a cramped city apartment where the sirens were my nightly lullaby. Every dollar I earned, every sacrifice I made, was a brick in the foundation of this house. It was more than a home. It was my studio, my retreat, the physical proof that my life, a life I had built entirely on my own terms, was a success. My mother, Linda, remarried 5 years ago. My father's passing left a void in her that she seemed desperate to fill, and Richard slid into that space with an unsettling ease. He was a man's man in the most stereotypical sense, big-bellied, loud, with a firm handshake for men and a dismissive pat on the arm for women. He sold construction equipment and carried the scent of stale cigars and cheap cologne. From our very first meeting at a sterile chain restaurant, I felt a chasm open between us. I tried for my mother's sake. I'd smiled through his condescending explanations of things I already knew, listened to his booming opinions on politics, and politely deflected his intrusive questions about my finances. But there was a fundamental disconnect in the way we saw the world. I saw it as a place of potential, of art and creation. He saw it as a hierarchy, one where he naturally sat near the top. It didn't take long for his assessment of me to become clear. To Richard, I was an anomaly he couldn't categorize, and therefore couldn't respect. A woman in her 30s, single, self-employed, and financially independent. I didn't fit into the neat boxes he had for the women in his life, wife, daughter, secretary. The first time he articulated it was during a family barbecue at their house, a stuffy suburban colonial that smelled of potpourri, and my mother's anxiety. I had just closed the deal on the lake house, and I was buzzing with excitement, eager to share the news. I bought a house, I announced, holding up my phone to show them a picture. My mother gasped, her eyes wide with what I hoped was pride. "Oh, Emily, it's beautiful. Where is it?" Richard squinted at the screen, leaning over my mother's shoulder. He grunted, a low, rumbling sound of disapproval. "That's a lot of house for one person," he said, not looking at me, but at the men gathered around the grill. "Must have cost a pretty penny. You get some help with the down payment." The implication was clear. A little woman like me couldn't possibly have done this on her own. "No, Richard," I said, my voice colder than I intended. "I paid for it myself with money I earned." He chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. He took a long swig of his beer and finally turned his gaze on me. It wasn't a look of admiration. It was a look of appraisal, like he was inspecting livestock. "Well, I'll be," he said, the words as if they were an insult. Your mother here worries, you know. 34 and no prospects. A place like that, it's a family home. Wasted on a single girl, just playing with paint chips. Then came the line that would become his mantra, the label he stamped on my forehead. Every time he looked at me, he gestured vaguely with his beer bottle. It's a damn shame. All that potential. And you end up a useless, unmarried woman. The air went still. The sizzle of the burgers on the grill seemed to grow louder. My mother's smile froze on her face, her eyes darting between me and her new husband. A silent plea for me to let it go, to not make a scene. And I didn't. I swallowed the rage that rose hot and metallic in my throat. I smiled a tight, brittle smile and changed the subject for my mother. I always did it for my mother. But the word settled deep in my bones, useless, unmarried. He had reduced my entire existence, my degree, my thriving business, my independence, my dream that was now a tangible reality of wood and glass, to my lack of a husband. He didn't see Emily Carson, architect. He saw a spinster, a problem to be solved, an asset to be managed, and my lake house wasn't my achievement. It was a resource being squandered. In that moment, I realized he didn't just dislike me. He fundamentally disdained the life I had built. And that disdain, I would soon learn, was a greedy, creeping thing, looking for something to devour. My house, my beautiful, peaceful house, was the first thing in its path. The first month at the lake house was bliss. It was a period of quiet unpacking, both of boxes, and of my own tightly wound nerves. I spent my days arranging furniture to maximize the morning light, and my evenings on the deck, a glass of wine in hand, watching the sun bleed into the water. The silence was a balm, broken only by the cry of a loon or the rustle of deer in the woods. I was setting up my studio in the loft, my drafting table positioned perfectly before the large triangular window. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely at peace, grounded in a space that was wholly mine. Then the visits began. Initially, they were framed as supportive gestures. My mother, Linda, would call beforehand. "We are just so proud, sweetie. We want to see how you're settling in. We'll bring lunch." And they would arrive. My mother carrying a grocery bag filled with deli sandwiches, and Richard carrying a toolbox. My mother would flutter round, admiring my paint choices and telling me how wonderful everything was, her voice a little too bright, a little too strained. She was running interference. I knew she was trying to soften the edges of her husband's presence. Richard, meanwhile, would walk the property with the air of a building inspector looking for code violations. He'd run his hand along the deck railing and declare, "This needs another coat of sealant before winter." He'd stare at the ancient, sprawling oak tree near the shore. "You'll want to take that down. A storm comes through. A branch that size will go right through your roof." He wasn't offering advice. He was issuing decrees. Every suggestion was a subtle chipping away at my authority, an assertion of his own supposed expertise. My professional opinion as a designer meant nothing. His status as the man of the family, he believed, made him the ultimate authority on all things domestic. "Oh, Richard's just being helpful, Emily," my mother would say later on the phone after I'd ventured a mild complaint. "He worries. He sees you here all alone and he just wants to make sure you're safe." But it didn't feel like concern. It felt like criticism. It felt like he was looking at my greatest achievement and only seeing flaws that he, and only he, could fix. The visits grew more frequent, and the pretense of a phone call was soon dropped entirely. I'd be in the middle of a client consultation on Zoom, and his oversized pickup truck would come crunching up my gravel driveway. They'd let themselves in with the spare key I'd reluctantly given my mother for emergencies. The emergency, it seemed, was my continued state of self-sufficiency. Richard would start projects without asking. One Saturday, I came downstairs to find he had dismantled the antique brass lock on my front door, replacing it with a clunky, ugly keypad lock. "State of the art," he announced proudly, dusting his hands. "You can give us the family code. Much easier than fiddling with keys." "I like the old lock, Richard," I said, my voice tight. "It was original to the house." He waved a dismissive hand. "Sentimentality is how you get robbed. This is for security." "My security. My house." His decision. My mother stood by the kitchen island, arranging a bouquet of grocery store carnations in a vase. She wouldn't meet my eye. "It's a very modern lock, dear," she offered meekly. "He was just thinking of you." This was her role. She was the apologist, the buffer. Her loyalty was no longer to her daughter, but to the fragile piece of her second marriage, a piece that required my constant concession to her. My boundaries were an inconvenience, a disruption to the new family unit she had so carefully constructed. The true turning point came in August. The air was thick and heavy with the promise of a thunderstorm. I was working on a deadline, completely immersed in a set of blueprints, when I heard the sound of unfamiliar laughter coming from my yard. I looked out the window and my heart sank. Richard and my mother were on my deck, setting up lawn chairs. With them were Richard's son from his first marriage, David, his wife, and their two noisy, hyperactive children. They had brought coolers. They had brought pool noodles. They had turned my sanctuary into their weekend clubhouse. I walked outside, my face a thundercloud that matched the sky. "What is this?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. My mother flinched. "Emily." We tried to call. David and the kids were in the area, and they were just dying to see the lake. "We thought we'd all surprise you." Richard, however, felt no such need for excuses. He was manning my new gas grill, a set of tongs in his hand, a king in his conquered castle. "Lighten up, Em," he boomed. "It's a beautiful day." The kids needed to get out of their hot apartment. "This place is perfect for them." He gestured expansively at my yard, my dock, my small strip of private shoreline. "It's a waste for it to just sit here empty most of the time." And then came the line he had been building towards for weeks, the thought that had been festering behind his condescending smiles and unsolicited help. He looked from his gleeful grandchildren splashing at the water's edge to me, standing alone and rigid on my own property. "You know," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, almost reasonable tone, "a big house like this, a big yard, it's a lot for one person to handle. Honestly, the family needs it more than you do." There it was, the quiet part said loud, my home wasn't mine. It was a resource, a commodity to be allocated by him to the most deserving party. And a single woman, in his eyes, could never be as deserving as a real family. I looked at my mother, searching her face for any sign of protest, any flicker of defense on my behalf. I found none. She was looking at her grandchildren, a soft, wistful smile on her face. In that moment, watching them treat my home as their personal resort, she agreed with him. I could see it. I wasn't just being sensitive. I wasn't imagining things. This was a siege, and they had just fired the opening shot. The impromptu party ended as the sky turned a bruised purple over the lake. David and his family packed up their wet towels and screaming children, leaving behind a yard littered with crushed potato chip bags and the lingering scent of citronella. I had spent the afternoon as a ghost in my own home, my smile a tight, aching mask. Now, only my mother and Richard remained. They were staying for dinner, an assumption they'd made without consulting me. Richard had been drinking steadily since he'd arrived, transitioning from beer to whiskey as the sun went down, and his voice had taken on a thick, belligerent edge. He was standing at my wall of windows, a heavy glass tumbler in his hand, staring out at the darkening water. He'd been talking for 10 straight minutes, laying out his vision for my property. It was a grand monologue full of plans for a new, larger dock that could accommodate his son's boat, the removal of a cluster of birch trees to improve the view from the master bedroom, his preferred view. Apparently, and most egregiously, the conversion of my loft studio. That whole upstairs area is wasted space, Emily, he slurred, turning to face me. His eyes were glassy, his face flushed with alcohol, and a sense of absolute authority. A drafting table. What a joke. We could drywall that off. Put in a proper queen bed and a dresser. It would be a perfect guest suite for David's family when they visit. My mother was busy in the kitchen, clattering dishes with a frantic energy, pretending not to hear the conversation that was making my skin crawl, but I was done letting her faint deafness be an excuse. I placed my hands flat on the cool granite of the kitchen island, grounding myself. Richard, that's my studio, I said, my voice low and even. It's where I work. I'm not converting it into a bedroom. He let out a short, barking laugh. Work? You call that work? Doodling on paper. This is a family asset now. It needs to be practical. It's not a family asset, I replied, the words tasting like ice. It's my house, and I'm telling you no. The jovial, drunken mask fell away. His face hardened, the flush deepening to an angry crimson. Don't you take that tone with me in this house. This is my house, I repeated, and I felt a tremor of something dangerous and liberating run through me. I was finally saying it. My name is on the deed. My money paid for it. You don't get to make decisions about it. None, I stated. He took a step towards me, his bulk seeming to suck the air from the room. You ungrateful little brat. After everything we do for you, coming out here, fixing this place up, fixing it, you changed a lock I didn't want changed and criticized my landscaping. You haven't done anything but try to take over. Richard, please, my mother interjected, her voice a thin thread. My mother's voice was a weak whisper from the kitchen. Let's not fight. He ignored her completely. His focus was entirely on me. His eyes narrowed to slits. You need a man to tell you what to do with a place like this. You're in over your head playing house like a little girl. Get out, I said. The words came out before I could even think about them. Both of you, get out of my house now. The movement was a blur. One moment he was standing by the window. The next he was in front of me. His whiskey-sour breath washed over my face as he raised his hand. I flinched, but I was too slow. The crack of his open palm against my cheek echoed in the high-ceilinged room. My head snapped to the side, and a sharp, stinging heat exploded across my skin. The shock was a white flash, silencing the crickets outside, stopping the hum of the refrigerator. For a heartbeat, the world was utterly silent, except for the ringing in my own ear. I slowly turned my head back, my eyes wide, my cheek throbbing with a pain that felt alien and obscene. I stared at him, at this man my mother had married, this intruder, who had just struck me in the sanctuary I had built with my own two hands. My first instinct, a primal, childish one, was to look at my mother. I searched for her, my eyes pleading. She would see this. This was the line. This was the moment she would finally transform back into the mother, who had kissed my scraped knees and chased away monsters from under my bed. She would rush to my side. She would stand between us. She would tell this man to get out and never come back. But she didn't. Linda stood frozen by the sink, her hands dripping soapy water onto the floor. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a terrified, frantic energy. But she didn't look at the red mark blooming on my face. She looked at Richard. Her first move wasn't towards me, her daughter, who had just been assaulted. It was towards him, her husband, who had just committed the assault. She took a hesitant step, her hands fluttering in the air, as if she didn't know what to do with them. "Richard," she said, her voice trembling. "Oh, goodness." And then she looked at me. There was no outrage in her eyes, no protective fury, only a desperate, panicked plea. "Emily, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't make a big deal out of this. You know how he gets when he's been drinking. He's got a hot temper, that's all. Don't make a big deal out of this." The words hit me with more force than his hand had. The sting on my cheek was nothing compared to the profound hollow ache that opened up in my chest. He had crossed a line of physical violence, but she had just crossed a line of betrayal so deep it felt like a part of my soul had been carved out. She was not going to protect me. She was not going to defend me. She was going to manage the situation, smooth things over, and her priority was not my safety or my dignity, but his comfort. She was choosing him in the most clear and brutal way possible. She was choosing him over me. In that horrifyingly quiet moment, with my cheek on fire and my mother's pathetic excuses hanging in the air, a lifetime of illusions shattered. The hope that she would ever stand up for me, the belief that our bond was unconditional, the fantasy that this was a family I needed to appease, it all turned to dust. I was completely and utterly alone. There was no one coming to save me. No one would fight for me. The shock receded, and in its place, something cold and hard and clear began to form. The tears that had pricked my eyes a moment before evaporated. The fear that had made me tremble was replaced by a chilling calm. If I was the only one who would protect me, then I would protect myself. If I was the only one who would fight for this house, then I would fight. They thought I was weak. They thought I was a child they could bully and control. They had no idea who they had just created. The silence that followed their departure was heavier than any sound. After I heard the crunch of Richard's truck pulling away, I walked to the front door, my cheek still a map of radiating heat. I didn't just lock it. I engaged the deadbolt, slid the chain across, and then I spent the next 10 minutes online, ordering a completely new lock set to be delivered the next day. I deleted the family code from the keypad that Richard had installed, wiping their access from the system with a few deliberate taps. Each action was small, precise, and final. It was the beginning of building a fortress. They gave me a week of blessed quiet, a week where I could almost pretend it hadn't happened. But the red-purple bruise on my cheek was a stubborn, fading reminder. I worked with a ferocious intensity, burying myself in layouts and client emails. The clean, logical lines of my blueprints were a welcome antidote to the messy chaos of my family life. I didn't answer my mother's calls. They went to voicemail. Each message was a little more frantic, a little more cloying than the last. "Emily, sweetie, please call me. We need to talk about this misunderstanding. Richard feels just terrible." I deleted them without listening to the end. I knew what they were. They weren't apologies. They were summonses. The full-scale assault began the following Sunday. It was orchestrated. I could tell they didn't come to my house this time. They knew they no longer had access. Instead, my mother called, and when I finally answered, insisted I come to their house for dinner. "We need to clear the air as a family," she'd said, her voice dripping with a false, syrupy reasonableness. "We can't have this ugliness between us." Against my better judgment, I went. I knew I couldn't hide forever. I had to face them. I walked into a carefully staged scene. Richard was sitting in his favorite recliner, a Bible on the end table next to him, looking for all the world like a benevolent patriarch wronged by a wayward child. My mother ushered me in, her hand fluttering nervously at my back. "Emily," Richard began, his voice a low, somber rumble. He didn't stand up. "What happened the other night?" I was out of line. I'd had a few too many. And you and I were both strong-willed people. We clashed. I regret that. It was the most disingenuous apology I had ever heard. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was an accusation of my complicity. We clashed. Before I could respond, my mother swooped in, placing a folder on the coffee table. That's why we think this is for the best, she said, her smile brittle. It's a way to move forward, to make sure we are all on the same page as a family. I opened the folder. Inside was a multi-page document, dense with legal jargon. The title at the top read, Family Stewardship and Use Agreement. My blood ran cold. I scanned the paragraphs, my mind accustomed to the precision of contracts and architectural specs, quickly cutting through the convoluted language. It was a masterpiece of predatory manipulation. It talked about shared responsibilities for upkeep, pooling of familial resources, and granting stewardship rights to Linda and Richard Carson for the purpose of maximizing the property's value and utility for the extended family. It was a legal document that would, in essence, strip me of my exclusive rights to my own home. It gave them the power to make decisions, to use the property as they saw fit, to treat it as a communal asset. It wasn't a temporary transfer. It was a permanent coup. You want me to sign this? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I looked from the papers to my mother's expectant face, to Richard's smug one. It's just a formality, honey, my mother said quickly. It protects you. Really? It means we can officially help you with the big expenses, the taxes, the insurance. It puts it all under the family umbrella. It makes it ours, Richard clarified, dispensing with the niceties. This is how families work. We share. You've had your fun playing house, but it's time to be a grown-up and contribute to the family. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. No, I said. The word was a stone. Small, but impossibly heavy. Absolutely not. Richard's benevolent mask vanished. Don't be a fool, Emily. I'm not signing my house away to you, I said, standing up. This conversation is over. That was when they unleashed their army. The failure of their direct assault simply meant they would now wage a campaign of psychological warfare. It started with my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister. She called the next day. Emily, dear, I heard there was some unpleasantness. Your mother is just beside herself with worry. She feels you're pushing her away. That house is a big responsibility. You know, it's a blessing that Richard is willing to step in and help manage things. Then came the texts from my cousins, people I hadn't spoken to in months. Heard you're being really selfish about the lakehouse. Not a good look, and family is supposed to help each other. What's your problem? The narrative had been written and distributed with stunning efficiency. I was the villain. I was the selfish, ungrateful daughter, who had stumbled into a fortune, and was now hoarding it from her long-suffering family. Richard wasn't a violent, controlling bully. He was a responsible stepfather trying to help. My mother wasn't his weak-willed enabler. She was a heartbroken matriarch being cast out into the cold by her cruel child. They were poisoning the well, turning the very people, who were supposed to be my support system into a chorus of condemnation. Every ping of my phone was a fresh wave of anxiety, a new voice telling me I was wrong. I was cold. I was unreasonable. The final and most devastating blow came from my mother. She called late one night after a week of my ignoring her. This time, her voice wasn't syrupy or pleading. It was cold, laced with a venomous self-pity. I don't know what I did to raise such a daughter, she began. No preamble, no hello. The things people are saying, Emily, my own sister thinks you're a monster. Richard's family thinks you're a greedy, spoiled child. You're humiliating me. I'm humiliating you. I asked, disbelief making my voice shake. He put his hands on me, Mom, in my own home, and you're worried about what Richard's family thinks. You provoked him, she shrieked, the facade of composure finally cracking. You were disrespectful. You have this beautiful home, a place our whole family could be enjoying, making memories, and you're keeping it all to yourself like a dragon guarding a pile of gold. It's not right. I was silent, the injustice of it all stealing my breath. You are being so cruel, she said, her voice dropping to a low, trembling whisper that was more cutting than any scream. You have no idea how cruel you are being. Do you know what people are going to think? They are going to think you've abandoned your own mother and stepfather. They'll think you've left us with nothing while you live in luxury on that lake. Is that the kind of daughter you want to be? The word hung in the air between us, cruel. She had taken my self-preservation and twisted it into a sin. She had taken her husband's violence and erased it. All that was left was my selfishness, my cruelty. The phone call wasn't an attempt to reconcile. It was a final, deliberate severing of any illusion I had left. She wasn't just on his side. She was the chief architect of the campaign against me, and she was willing to burn down every good memory we ever had to get what she wanted. When I hung up the phone, the word cruel echoed in the profound silence of my house. It didn't just sting, it branded me. In my mother's version of the story, I was no longer her daughter. I was a villain, a cold-hearted creature of pure selfishness. The accusation was so grotesquely twisted, so far from the truth of my own aching heart, that it performed a strange kind of alchemy. The pain of her betrayal, a raw and gaping wound, began to crystallize. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my gut, but it was now encased in a shell of ice-cold clarity. Tears would not help me. Pleading would not help me. My mother had shown me her weapon of choice, emotional blackmail and public opinion. It was time to choose mine, the cold, hard, and irrefutable truth. The next morning, I didn't wallow in bed. I rose with the sun, the pale light illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Each one a tiny, insignificant problem. My problem was large, but it was not insurmountable. I went to the heavy steel safe tucked away in my office closet. The tumblers clicked open with a satisfying finality. Inside, nestled beneath my business incorporation papers and my passport, was a thick manila envelope. I pulled it out and spread the contents across my drafting table, the same surface Richard had derided as a joke. Here was the deed to the property, the raised seal of the county clerk cool beneath my fingertips. My name, Emily Carson, was typed in stark black ink. An unmarried woman. There was no mention of Linda Carson. No mention of Richard. Here were the closing statements. Page after page of figures and signatures. A testament to years of fiscal discipline. Here was the title insurance policy, a guarantee against any claims to my ownership. And here was my homeowner's insurance contract, another document bearing my name and my name alone, protecting my asset. I ran my fingers over the papers, the crisp edges a comfort. This was not opinion. This was not family law or emotional manipulation. This was fact, printed and notarized. This was my armor. My next call was to Arthur Vance. He was the attorney who had handled the closing on the house. A quiet, meticulous man in his late 60s with a mind like a steel trap. He had seen the joy on my face the day I signed the final papers. Now, sitting in his quiet, book-lined office downtown, I explained the situation, my voice steady, relaying the events without emotion or embellishment. I spoke of the escalating entitlement, the unauthorized use of my property, the physical assault, and the subsequent demand that I sign over legal rights. I slid the family stewardship and use agreement they had drafted across his polished mahogany desk. Arthur read it slowly, his expression unchanging. When he was done, He took off his reading glasses and looked at me over his steepled fingers. He didn't offer sympathy or platitudes. He offered something far better, validation. "This document is amateurishly drafted, but its intent is perfectly clear," he said, his voice calm and precise. "It's an attempt at a coerced transfer of interest. It is, in a word, garbage. But the strategy behind it, this campaign of harassment, is not. They are trying to wear you down, to make you believe you are unreasonable." "So what do I do?" I asked. "You do nothing that they ask," he stated. "You do not engage. You do not argue. Your position is already fortified. You are the sole, unencumbered owner of the property. The law is unequivocally on your side. What we can do is formalize your position." He outlined a plan. He would draft a formal cease and desist letter to be sent via certified mail to Richard and my mother, clearly stating that they were not to enter my property without my explicit prior consent. Any uninvited appearance would be considered trespassing and would be reported to the police. "It will seem aggressive to them," Arthur warned. "It will pour gasoline on the fire of their narrative that you are cruel." "Let it," I said, the words tasting of iron. "The fire is already burning." Leaving Arthur's office, I felt lighter, but the fight was far from over. He was handling the legal front, but I had to secure the physical one. That afternoon, I drove to an electronics store and bought a set of high-definition wireless security cameras. That evening, I became my own security consultant. I placed one camera tucked under the eaves of the porch, its wide-angle lens capturing the entire driveway and the front door. I placed another on the back deck overlooking the yard and the path to the lake. The last one was the hardest. I placed it on a high bookshelf in the main living area, its small black eye pointing towards the front windows and the door. The very act felt like a desecration. I was violating my own sanctuary, turning my home into a monitored space. Every time I glanced at its tiny, discreet form, I would be reminded that I was not safe, that the threat was not from a stranger, but from my own blood. As I sat at my laptop, configuring the system, and watching the crisp color feeds of my own empty house appear on the screen, the full weight of my internal conflict crashed down on me. Grief and resolve were warring factions inside me. A part of me, the little girl who still lived somewhere in my heart, was crying. She was mourning the loss of her mother, not to death, but to a man with cheap cologne and a tyrant's heart. She was replaying every birthday, every Christmas, every moment of shared laughter, and asking, was none of it real? How could you choose him over me? But another part of me, the woman who had signed the deed, the architect who had built a life from scratch, the client who had just calmly instructed her lawyer to send a cease and desist letter, was resolute. That woman knew that mourning was a luxury she could afford later. Right now, survival was the priority. Protecting this house was not just about protecting a financial asset. It was about protecting the person I had become. It was the physical manifestation of my independence, my competence, my right to exist on my own terms without a man to manage me. Richard and my mother weren't just trying to take a house. They were trying to take me. They were trying to break me down and force me back into a box I had spent my entire adult life climbing out of. And I would not let them. I would feel the pain. I would mourn the loss, but I would not yield. The cease and desist letter landed with the force of a grenade. The explosion, however, was delayed. For 2 weeks after Arthur's certified letter was delivered, there was nothing but an unnerving, radioactive silence. The angry texts from my cousin stopped. My mother's pleading voicemails ceased. I allowed a small, foolish part of myself to hope that the formal legal language had actually worked, that the threat of real-world consequences had forced them to retreat. I should have known better. Richard was not a man who retreated. He was a man who regrouped and planned a full frontal assault. It happened on a perfect, sun-drenched Saturday afternoon. I was in my loft studio, finalizing a lighting design for a client. The house was filled with the scent of fresh coffee and the quiet hum of my laptop. Then came the familiar, gut-wrenching sound of Richard's diesel truck crunching on my gravel driveway. I looked out the window and my heart hammered against my ribs. It wasn't just his truck. Behind him was my Aunt Carol's sedan, and behind that, my cousin Steve's minivan. It was a convoy, an invading army. I watched, frozen, as they piled out. Richard, my mother, my aunt and uncle, and two of my cousins with their spouses. They didn't come to the door. They didn't even look at the house. They began unloading coolers, foldable lawn chairs, and a portable grill from the beds of their trucks. My mother directed the placement of the chairs on my lawn, as if she were arranging furniture in her own living room. It was a performance, a deliberate and audacious act of defiance staged for my benefit. They were not here to visit. They were here to occupy. My phone buzzed on the drafting table. It was a notification from my security app. Motion detected in driveway. A grim, humorless smile touched my lips. Yes, I thought. I see it. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was adrenaline. A cold, furious energy that sharpened my senses. I walked down the stairs, my movements measured. I could hear their laughter through the windows. A sound that had once meant family and warmth now twisted into the sound of mockery. I took a deep breath, opened the sliding glass door to the deck, and stepped outside. All conversation stopped. A dozen pairs of eyes turned to me. Richard was standing by the grill he'd set up on my flagstone patio, holding a pair of tongs like a scepter. He had a smug, triumphant look on his face. "You are trespassing," I said. My voice came out stronger than I expected, carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "You were served with a legal notice to stay off this property." Aunt Carol gasped, putting a hand to her chest in a gesture of theatrical offense. "Well, I never, Emily. Is that any way to talk to your family?" Richard let out a booming laugh. He took a step forward, waving a crumpled piece of paper in his hand. It was the letter from Arthur. "This? You mean this pathetic piece of paper from your shyster lawyer? This doesn't mean a thing. This is a family matter, and we are going to solve it as a family." "The only thing to solve is you leaving," I said, keeping my eyes locked on his. "You are not welcome here." The smugness evaporated from his face, replaced by the familiar blotchy red of his rage. He took another step, invading my personal space, forcing me to tilt my head back to look at him. He was a wall of booze-fueled fury. "Listen to me, you selfish little woman," he spat, his voice low and guttural. "We are tired of your games. We are your family, and this house belongs to the family. It's for everyone to use, not for you to hide away in like some crazy old spinster." He gestured wildly to the yard, to the lake, to the very deck I was standing on. His voice rose to a full-throated roar, a declaration for all the relatives to hear. "If you don't like it, you can get out. This is a family home, not yours." My mother rushed forward then, not to defend me, but to play her part. "Emily, please," she begged, her eyes welling with crocodile tears. "Don't do this to us. Don't tear our family apart. We just want to have a nice barbecue. Why do you have to be so difficult?" "This is not a family home," I said, my voice shaking with the effort of keeping it level. I looked past Richard, past my weeping mother, to the faces of my extended family. They just stared, some with pity, some with contempt, all of them silent, all of them complicit. They were his willing audience. "I am telling you for the last time," I said, turning my gaze back to Richard. "Leave my property now, or I will call the police." That was the trigger. The mention of outside authority, the one thing he couldn't control with his bluster or his fists, sent him over the edge. "You wouldn't dare," he snarled. Watch me, I said, and my hand moved towards the pocket of my jeans where my phone was. His hand came up fast as a snake, the same hand that had struck me before. I saw the motion. I saw the tightening of his jaw. I saw the crazed look in his eyes, and the memory of the crack, the sting, the humiliation flashed through me. But this time, I didn't flinch. I didn't cower. The part of me that was scared had died in this same spot weeks ago. I stood my ground, my eyes blazing into his as his hand reached the apex of its arc, ready to swing down. My voice sliced through the air, cold and sharp as a shard of glass. Touch me again, I said, my voice ringing with absolute conviction. And you will meet the police. I didn't scream it. I didn't cry it. I stated it as an undeniable fact. My hand was now on my phone, my thumb resting on the screen. He froze, his hand hovering in the air between us, the threat still hanging there, potent and ugly. The yard was dead silent, the only sound the frantic buzzing of a bee near the lavender bush. In that moment, I let my gaze flicker for a fraction of a second up and to the left, towards the dark, discreet lens of the camera tucked under the eave of the porch. It was a look he didn't see, but a look I felt. I had a witness, a silent, perfect, unblinking witness. The power dynamic had just shifted, and by the stunned, confused look on his face, he was just beginning to realize it. Richard's hand hung in the air, a clumsy weapon paused mid-swing. The silence in the yard was absolute, a vacuum where the birdsong and the gentle lapping of the lake had been moments before. His face was a mask of confusion, his drunken rage colliding with a wall of defiance he had never expected. He had anticipated tears, pleading, or a retreat. He was not prepared for a clear, concise statement of fact. Slowly, deliberately, I lowered my hand from my phone. I held his gaze for a beat longer, letting him see that the fear he expected to find in my eyes was gone, replaced by something he couldn't read. Then, without another word, I turned my back on him and walked back into my house, sliding the glass door shut behind me. I could feel their collective stare on my back. I knew what they were thinking. They thought I was running, that I had made my threat, and was now retreating to cower inside. Let them think it. I walked through my living room, my steps echoing on the hardwood floor, and went directly to my office. I didn't grab the phone to call the police. Not yet. I retrieved the heavy manila envelope from my desk drawer. It was my real weapon, far more powerful than a 911 call. When I slid the door open again, and stepped back onto the deck, the scene was much as I had left it. Richard hadn't moved. My mother was wringing her hands, her face a mess of panic. The assembled relatives were shifting uncomfortably. The party atmosphere had completely evaporated, replaced by a tense, awkward uncertainty. I walked to the small patio table and calmly, methodically laid the contents of the envelope on its surface. The thick cream-colored paper of the deed, the dense stack of the closing statement, the glossy folder of the title insurance. I believe there is some confusion about the ownership of this property, I said, my voice resonating with a calm I didn't entirely feel. It was the voice I used with difficult contractors, a voice that brooked no argument. I picked up the deed. I held it up so they could all see the official letterhead of the county, the embossed seal glimmering in the afternoon sun. This, I announced, is the deed to 1214, Lakeshore Drive. It is a legal document filed and recorded by the state of Michigan. It is not a family agreement. It is not a piece of paper your lawyer can dismiss. I pointed to the signature line. It has one name on it, Emily Carson. Mine, and mine alone. I dropped the deed and picked up the closing statement. This is the financial record of the sale. Every dollar, every cent is accounted for. It shows the mortgage I secured in my own name, with my own credit, and the down payment I made with money from my own savings account. There is no mention of Linda Carson. There is no mention of Richard Carson, because neither of you contributed a single dime to the purchase of this house. A nervous cough broke the silence. My cousin Steve was looking at his shoes, suddenly fascinated by the state of his sneakers. Aunt Carol refused to look at me, her face a pinched mask of disapproval. They were beginning to understand. This wasn't the family drama they had been led to believe it was. This was something else entirely. The letter my attorney sent you was not a suggestion. I continued, my gaze sweeping over all of them, making eye contact with each uncomfortable relative before finally landing back on Richard. It was a legal warning. By coming here today, after receiving that warning, you are not having a family barbecue. You are, at this exact moment, committing the offense of criminal trespassing. The legal term, spoken aloud, changed the very air. It was no longer a vague accusation of being unwelcome. It was a specific, chargeable crime. I saw my uncle shift his weight, taking a half step away from his wife, as if to distance himself. My cousin's wife suddenly tugged on his arm, her eyes wide. They had come here to support Richard, to bully the selfish daughter into submission. They had not signed up to be accessories to a crime. So, I said, my voice dropping but losing none of its intensity, I am giving all of you one final chance. Every single person who is not named on this deed needs to pack up their belongings and leave my property immediately. Anyone who remains, anyone who sets foot here again without my express invitation, will be met by the police. I will press charges. I will file for a restraining order. I will use the full extent of the law to protect my home. Are we clear? The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Richard stood there, his face pale beneath the alcoholic flush, the crumpled legal letter still clutched in his fist. He looked from the papers on the table to my face and back again. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a stunned, impotent disbelief. He had no response. The facts were incontrovertible. He had built his entire campaign on a foundation of lies and entitlement, and I had just demolished it with a few pieces of paper. It was my mother who finally broke the spell. As she saw the tide turning, as she saw her relatives beginning to distance themselves from her and her husband, a desperate, frantic rage erupted from her. Her carefully constructed image of the wronged matriarch was crumbling, and she lunged for the only weapon she had left. She turned on me, her face twisted with a fury that was far more terrifying than Richard's had been. "How could you?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. The tears that had been for show before were now real, streaming down her face, but they were tears of rage, not sorrow. "How could you do this in front of everyone? You've shamed us. You've made us look like fools." I stared at her, speechless. He had threatened me. He had assaulted me. They were trespassing on my land. And her concern was for her public image. "You are so cruel, Emily," she screamed, jabbing a finger in my direction. "A cruel, heartless daughter. We just wanted to be a family, and you throw papers in our face. You've brought shame on this entire family." The words, the same ones she had whispered venomously over the phone, were now a public condemnation before our assembled relatives. My own mother, the woman who was supposed to be my fiercest protector, declared me the villain, not him, me. The silence returned, heavier and more profound than before, broken only by my mother's ragged, sobbing breaths. I stood there, legally vindicated, morally right, and utterly condemned by the one person whose approval I had once craved above all others. The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp-edged, cruel. For a moment, it felt like the world had gone into slow motion. I watched my mother's face, contorted by a rage born of pure desperation. I saw the spittle fly from her lips as she screamed. I saw my Aunt Carol's hand fly to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. I saw my uncle take another involuntary step back, as if the sheer toxicity of the moment was a physical force pushing him away. The assembled family members were no longer just an audience. They were witnesses to a complete immolation. My mother wasn't just losing an argument. She was setting fire to the very idea of her own motherhood right there on my lawn. And the word cruel. For my entire life, that would have been the kill shot. I had been raised to be a good girl, a nice daughter, to be kind, to be accommodating, to put the family's needs before my own. The accusation of cruelty, especially from my own mother, was meant to be a soul-destroying blow. It was designed to trigger deep, instinctual shame, to make me doubt my own mind, to force me to crumble and apologize and concede just to make it stop. Weeks ago, it would have worked. The night he hit me, her whisper of "don't make a big deal" had gutted me. The night she called me cruel on the phone, the word had left me hollow and shaking. But something was different now. Standing here in the clear light of day, with the proof of my ownership laid out on the table, and the memory of his raised hand still fresh in the air, the word didn't land like a dagger. It landed like a dud. Instead of pain, I felt a profound and chilling sense of detachment. I looked at this screaming, sobbing woman, and the last vestiges of the daughter who craved her approval simply vanished. I saw her with perfect, unclouded vision for the first time. I saw a woman who had allowed a man to strike her child and then protected him. A woman who had conspired to steal her daughter's home. A woman whose primary concern, even now, was not the truth or what was right, but her own social standing. Her definition of cruelty was anything that inconvenienced her or threatened the fragile reality she had built with her bully of a husband. I let the silence stretch out, letting her accusation hang there, unsupported, until it began to feel absurd. Her ragged sobs were the only sound. The rest of the family stood like statues in a garden of shame. They had come here expecting to witness the taming of a difficult daughter. They were instead witnessing the moral disintegration of a mother. When I finally spoke, my voice was devoid of the rage and hysteria that had colored hers. It was quiet, measured, and carried the weight of an unassailable truth. I looked directly at her, past the tears and the theatrical anguish, and into the eyes of the stranger she had become. "You keep using that word," I said, my voice as calm as the lake behind me. "But I don't think you know what it means." I paused, letting my words sink in. I saw a flicker of confusion in her eyes. This wasn't the reaction she had rehearsed. There was no apology, no defensive outcry. "Cruelty," I continued, my gaze steady, "is a man putting his hands on your daughter and you telling her she has a hot temper. Cruelty is telling that daughter not to make a big deal out of it because you're more afraid of his anger than you are concerned for her safety." I saw Richard flinch at the mention of it. I saw Aunt Carol's eyes dart from me to him, a new, dawning understanding on her face. The private facts were now becoming public. "Cruelty," I went on, my voice gaining strength with each word, "is conspiring with that man to try and take away the one thing your daughter has built for herself. The home she paid for with her own work, her own sweat, her own sacrifices. Cruelty is drafting a legal document designed to trick her into signing her life's dream away to you." My cousin Steve was now looking at his mother, a silent question in his eyes. The narrative they had been fed was unraveling before them, thread by ugly thread. Cruelty is mobilizing our entire family, feeding them a story full of lies about my selfishness, and using them as your personal army to come here and intimidate me. It is turning people, who should be my support, into your weapons. Finally, I looked away from my mother and let my gaze sweep over the whole silent party. "And cruelty is standing here after all of that and calling me cruel for refusing to be a victim, for refusing to be bullied, for refusing to be stolen from." I let that hang in the air for a long moment before delivering the final, simple truth. I looked back at her, my heart aching, not with shame, but with the cold, hard grief of a final goodbye. "I am not being cruel," I said, my voice softening, not with weakness, but with the certainty of my position. "I am simply protecting what is mine. This house is mine. These documents prove it, and you are standing on it. The only thing cruel here is the belief that you were ever entitled to any of it. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It wasn't tense and uncertain. It was the heavy, damning silence of a verdict delivered. My mother just stared, her mouth slightly open, her tears stopped, her face a blank canvas of shock. Her ultimate weapon had been dismantled, analyzed, and shown to be a cheap, hollow thing. She had nothing left. The shame she had tried to heap upon me had settled squarely back on her own shoulders, and it was a weight she could not seem to bear. She looked, for the first time, utterly and completely defeated. My mother's defeat left a gaping void on the battlefield of my lawn. For a few tense seconds, no one seemed to know what to do. Her primary role had been to provide the emotional cover, the moral justification for their aggression. With her silenced, her arguments dismantled, there was nothing left but the raw, ugly reality of their failed intimidation. The relatives looked at each other, a silent, panicked communication passing between them. They had hitched their wagons to a losing horse. It was Richard who filled the void, and he filled it with pure, undiluted rage. My calm, logical dissection of the word cruel had not pacified him. It had stripped him of his last shield. He had been exposed in front of his wife, his family, his audience, not as a concerned patriarch, but as a violent, manipulative thief. The public humiliation was more than his fragile ego could withstand. The last veneer of civility burned away, and the brutish core of the man was laid bare. "You think you're so smart," he growled, the words a low rumble in his chest. He took a step toward the patio table, his eyes fixed on the legal documents lying there. His intention was clear: if he couldn't win the argument, he would destroy the evidence. "You think these papers make you better than us?" He lunged for the deed. My reaction was instantaneous, but it wasn't a flinch or a scream. It was a sharp, clear, and final decision. As his thick fingers reached for the papers that represented my life's work, I took a single, calm step back, pulling my phone from my pocket. My movements were fluid and deliberate, a stark contrast to his clumsy, rage-fueled lunge. He snatched the papers, clutching them in his fist, a triumphant sneer twisting his lips. He thought he had won. He thought he had captured the flag. He hadn't noticed that my thumb was already swiping across the screen of my phone. He didn't see me tap the green phone icon. He didn't see me press the 3 numbers I had promised myself I would press if he crossed this final line. I held the phone to my ear, my eyes locked on his. The sneer on his face faltered as he finally realized what I was doing. "What do you think you're doing?" he snarled, taking a threatening step towards me, crumpling the deed in his hand. "Put that phone down. This is a family matter." A calm female voice answered on the other end of the line. 911, what is your emergency? I didn't break eye contact with Richard. My voice was as clear and steady as if I were ordering a pizza. "Hello," I said. "My name is Emily Carson. I am at 1214, Lakeshore Drive. I need to report a group of trespassers on my property." Richard froze. The color drained from his face. My mother let out a strangled gasp. "Emily, no. Don't you dare." I ignored her. My entire focus was on the man in front of me. I have asked them to leave multiple times. They are refusing. One of them, a man named Richard Carson, has just assaulted me. "I didn't touch you," he roared, a note of genuine panic now creeping into his voice. "He has threatened me and is now destroying my legal documents," I continued calmly into the phone. "I am the homeowner. I am here alone and I am feeling unsafe. We are dispatching a car to your location," the operator said. "Are you in a safe place?" "I am standing on my back deck." "They are on my lawn." "Okay, A patrol car is on its way. Stay on the line if you can." I lowered the phone from my ear, but didn't hang up. I just held it in my hand, the open line a tangible link to the world of consequences that was at that very moment speeding towards us. For a few seconds, the only sound was the wind in the pines. The relatives stood like a herd of spooked deer, their faces pale with shock. They had come here for a family drama, not a police report. This was real. This was a line from which there was no coming back. And then we heard it. It started as a faint, almost imperceptible rise and fall in the distance. A sound that could have been the wind, but it grew steadily, resolving itself into a distinct, unmistakable wail, a police siren. The sound shattered the paralysis. A wave of pure panic washed over the assembled family. My Aunt Carol grabbed my uncle's arm, her face a mask of horror. "Bill, we have to go now." My cousin Steve was already herding his wife toward their minivan, his face ashen. The party was over. The coolers were forgotten. The carefully constructed facade of family solidarity dissolved into a frantic, every man for himself scramble. They were no longer Richard's army. They were potential witnesses, accessories. Their names about to be written down in an official report. Richard stood rooted to the spot, the crumpled deed still in his fist. The siren was getting closer now, its cry echoing across the placid water of the lake. The sound seemed to be aimed directly at him, a sonic arrow piercing his inflated sense of authority. He looked from me to my mother, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading confusion. He had never in his entire life faced a consequence he couldn't bully his way out of. The approaching sound was the sound of his world ending. My mother was staring at me, her face a wasteland of disbelief and betrayal. She saw the police not as a source of protection for her daughter, but as the ultimate symbol of her public humiliation. I had broken the sacred, unspoken family rule, you do not air your dirty laundry. As the cars of my relatives screeched out of the driveway, and the siren grew to an ear-splitting proximity, I walked back to the patio table. I picked up the remaining documents, the closing statement, the insurance policies. I held them in one hand, a neat stack of irrefutable facts. I looked at Richard, at my mother, the two people left on the sinking ship of their own making. The flashing blue and red lights were now visible through the trees, painting the yard in strobing, frantic colors. I held up the papers. My voice was not triumphant. It was not angry. It was the quiet, final voice of inevitability. This, I said, my words cutting through the wail of the siren, is the only evidence that has any value here. I looked from the papers to their panicked faces. You, I said, have nothing. The siren cut off abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. But the chaos wasn't gone. It had just become visual. Red and blue lights pulsed silently, washing over the trees, the deck, and the two frozen figures on my lawn. They painted streaks across my mother's stunned face, making her look like a ghost at a carnival. They flashed over Richard, who stood slack-jawed, the crumpled deed looking like a piece of trash in his hand. The authority he had projected, the sheer force of his blustering will, had vanished, sucked out of him by the silent, strobing lights. A car door slammed shut, a sound as final as a gavel, then another. Heavy footsteps crunched on my gravel driveway, confident and measured. The sounds were alien in my quiet sanctuary, yet they were the most welcome sounds I had ever heard. Then came the knock. It wasn't a polite tap. It wasn't the friendly rap of a neighbor. It was a firm, official, three-part knock on the solid wood of my front door. Thump, thump, thump. It was a sound that expected an answer. A sound that held all the power and authority that Richard had pretended to possess. At the sound, Richard flinched as if he'd been shot. The crumpled deed fell from his nerveless fingers and fluttered to the deck, a forgotten casualty of his failed war. He looked wildly from the front door to me, his eyes begging for something I no longer had to give, mercy, a way out, a reversal of time. He was just a man now, a trespasser about to explain himself to the law. My mother was a statue carved from salt. Her face was a blank mask of horror. Her eyes fixed on the door. This was her ultimate nightmare realized. The family drama, the ugly, private dispute she had tried so desperately to control and manipulate, had escaped its cage. It was now a public spectacle. The shame she had tried to weaponize against me had come for her in uniform, with a badge and a gun. I didn't look at them anymore. They had ceased to be the focus of my world. I turned my back on the wreckage of my family on the deck and walked calmly through my living room. The flashing lights from outside swept across the room, illuminating my path to the door. I held the stack of papers in my hand, the closing statement, the insurance, the title. They were my shield, my script, my truth. I opened the door. 2 police officers stood on my porch. They were younger than I expected, a man and a woman. Their expressions neutral and professional, their presence filled the doorway, a solid blue wall between my world and the chaos on the lawn. The male officer asked, his eyes briefly flicking past me to the scene on the deck before returning to my face. We received a call about a disturbance, a trespassing complaint. Yes, officer, I said, my voice even. Thank you for your prompt response. I'm Emily Carson. This is my home. I held out the stack of documents. He took them, his gaze scanning the top page, the title policy with my name in bold print. He nodded. A small, professional acknowledgement of fact. The people on my back deck were explicitly warned in writing by my attorney not to come onto this property, I explained, keeping my tone factual, devoid of emotion. They arrived uninvited an hour ago, and refused to leave. When I asked them again, the man, Richard Carson, became aggressive. The officer's eyes went to Richard, who was now trying to make himself look smaller, less threatening. His hands held awkwardly at his sides. I see, the officer said. He handed the papers back to me. We can handle it from here, Ms. Carson. I simply nodded. Thank you. I stepped back from the door, leaving it open, and retreated into the center of my living room. I didn't need to watch the rest. I didn't need to hear the excuses Richard would surely try to stammer out. I didn't need to see my mother's humiliation, as the officers escorted them off my land. The endgame was a foregone conclusion. My part in the battle was over. I stood there in the heart of the sanctuary I had fought for, and watched the silent light show play out on my walls. The red and blue flashes danced across the blueprints on my table, across the spines of my books, across the cool gray of the couch. The light from the large window overlooking the lake was fading now. The sun beginning its descent, and it caught the edges of the papers in my hand, making the official letterhead seem to glow. They had called me cruel. They had called me selfish. They had called me ungrateful. They had used every word in their arsenal to try and break me, to make me feel small, to make me doubt my own reality. They had tried to convince me that a family's desires outweighed an individual's rights, that my dream was merely a resource for them to consume. But as the sound of a car door shutting, the officers placing one of them in the back of the squad car perhaps reached my ears, I felt no cruelty in my heart. I felt no triumph. I felt only the quiet, profound, and unshakable strength of a boundary held. I had not attacked. I had not provoked. I had simply defended. I looked down at the deed in my hand, my name clear and strong on the page. This was the proof. This was the prize. It was not just a house. It was my life, my future, my peace, and I had protected it. They called me cruel. But as I stood there alone and finally secure in my own home, I knew the truth. That cruelty was my armor. That cruelty was my strength. That cruelty was the price of my freedom. And it was what kept my lake house mine, and mine alone. I'd love to connect with all of you. So, please drop a comment down below, and let me know where you're listening from today. I'm always fascinated to see how far these stories travel. If this resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button, as it really helps more people find our community. And finally, if you want to give this story an extra boost, please smash that hype button. Your support allows me to keep sharing these experiences with all of you.